So good morning, one and all here now. Tara and I are here again talking about the mental obsession and about, which is really the essence of addiction and the core of addiction. If it weren't for the mental obsession, compulsions and impulsiveness and reactiveness, I would suggest would be limited to, I, I suspect compulsions would vanish because we'd just be inspired to do what we're doing, and we may want to do it a lot, but if we're inspired, the thing we were doing a lot of would be healthy for us rather than something that was actually killing us. And if we're reactive, we're probably being more reactive to actual threats rather than these seeming self-imposed threats that are internal and cause so much stress in our bodily systems. And if we were impulsive, it would just be the spontaneity and synchronicity of the inspiration we had. It'd be a much different experience than being impulsively unable to sit still and sit with the discomfort and try to make believe that by denying it's there, somehow we're overcoming it while we're in fact tamping it down and creating more and more pressure internally. So the other point I wanted to make this morning, just a quick one, and I may have missed this, it may have just been clearer today, and that this isn't about not thinking. It is not about if reality for us as humans is everything that's happening, then thinking is something that happens. So on the basis of that concept, the thinking would be real. What we think about is what we struggle with. What we choose to think about is what we struggle with. How we take the sum total of everything happening and decide to translate that into something worth acting on. That's what our struggle is. And obsessive thinking has been obsessive so long, I know that when I talk about this with people, they hear me say, we need to learn to stop thinking, which is not at all what we're doing here. If there's a possibility of not thinking, there's also a possibility of not breathing, right? But if you don't breathe long enough, you generally pass out and start breathing. There's a sort of natural point to it that facilitates this experience we're having in this life form that we have responsibility for. So if that is the case, then it would be more responsible to think in terms that are substantive, have some relation to reality, and when they don't, at least acknowledge that what we're thinking is imagined rather than imagined reality. And something we crossed over last week or so, Tara, was we were talking about, and it kind of stuck with me after we stopped talking, and I went and just read a little bit more about connotation and semantics. And semantics basically is that language changes over time. It's always changing because each of our use of it is somewhat different. And very often that collective use changes the content of that word or that thing that's being said. But I would say it is not semantic if you're taking reality and making believe imagination all of a sudden becomes reality. You're trying to claim the opposite of the word is true. And I would say that evolution is a very gradual, slow process that occurs. And words obviously have evolved to have meanings today they didn't have 100 years ago. And there's a fairly accepted understanding of what those words are, but it's easy to fight about the words when you think your thoughts are real. You begin to think the words you're speaking have to be heard in the way you're saying them, and think that everyone else has to then say them that way to make believe that somehow or another they're understanding what you're saying, rather than see that if we have a spiritual nature, we know more than we think, and as a result, we can't say enough to accommodate that knowing. And yet, if the spirit of our words is not being conflicted by the static we're creating in our own inner conflict, the chances are those words will convey in ways where we can identify what we know as a shared common denominator, rather than only think of it and having to say the right words at the right time in the right way. So my sense is that's a very different thing than simple variations of words. We're all allowed to freely think what we want, which means we all think differently. There's no way that we're thinking exactly the same as this. If we have all possibilities possible, the chances are that it's never going to be possible somebody else is choosing the exact same thing in the exact same way at the exact same time I am in my own thinking. So if we all share that, then coming to terms with that as a form of not trying to manipulate people into thinking the way I do, but see that their thinking is actually giving me a perspective that may actually stretch the bounds of my limited thought and actually give me an opportunity to realize what that cohesiveness and that synchronicity and that greater knowing awareness, how it's being expressed as a species, giving us all a chance to have a little pinpoint here and there about a different perspective that we may not be considering as our own. And the idea that it's my own and not yours is a major flaw in the thinking I'm doing about trying to communicate about something that we all share equally and inevitably, but not inevitably in time, but inevitably in the present. So that may be a mouthful, but here we are.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up semantics and connotation, and that probably was my favorite class
Well,
in undergrad was linguistics. It was so much fun to think about how our words change the way we perceive things. There's that standard sample of like the Eskimo and how many words there are for ice, or snow rather. And then, but what I really liked was colors. I still get fascinated when I see a box of crayons because I've not the best memory of details, but there's this, probably more than one, but there's at least one culture. I want to say it begins with an H, but it doesn't matter. But they only have light and dark. Those are the only two colors they have. It's either light or dark, and that's it. And so I love taking that thought and like applying it, bringing it down to everyday living and what that looks like in an everyday life of somebody that has only two colors. But that's on a small little playful level. But when you share what you share, which is very, I call cerebral. I don't even know if I'm saying the word right or if that's even the right word, but for me, it's very heady. But at the same time, it's fascinating because what I try to do is like the two colors, I try to bring it down a few levels and like, what does this mean? And what does this look like in everyday living? How does this apply to my human experience? And I joke that the alcoholic in me is like, I just want to know so I can manipulate it and maximize benefit. But that's a little bit playful, but a little bit true. But mostly now I've turned that desire into how do I bring Jack's wisdom, knowing, information, perception, insert whatever you want to call it, down to an everyday living benefit. How can I use this to benefit the upbringing of my children or my adult son? How do I use this to benefit? Last night, I got to be honest, I was like, I'm gonna ask Jack this because I'm pissed. I was in such. I have chronic pain and I probably need two new hips, and I'm just over. I was over the top irritated with it last night, and I realized in my frustration that I was losing hope. I was just simply losing hope that that this was going to be solved without going under the knife, or that this was going to be solved with enough faith. If I have enough faith and I do the right thing and I change my thinking, I will solve this hip pain and it'll go away. Because Jack says I'm causing this myself, so I can just think my way right the hell out of this. And last night I just was Here's the thing with an alcoholic. If you have chronic pain, you can go to the doctor and they can give you say pain medication. But the problem with pain medication is it takes away our way of living. If I'm on any kind of substance, I'm not connected to other humans. I'm not connected to source. I have no peace and serenity. My sponsor actually tried to commit suicide because of chronic pain. So I understand the seriousness of chronic pain and the seriousness of sobriety. And it sounds like I'm going off on a tangent, but where I'm bringing this back to you is this whole, how do we bring this living with two colors or living in Jack's world down to everyday living? And I see that as something that can benefit so many people if we can get your cerebral talking into everyday comprehension level. And I've said it before, I think that if Joseph Campbell was able to have a translator, how many more people could he have influenced and touched with his understanding and knowledge that he kind of walked around with an elite group and did not bring it down a few levels. You're
Well,
doing such a good job of being a good listener. I'm really impressed. You're working hard.
no, I really appreciate it. I mean, there's about 75 points I'd like to make, but the essence is, Tara, and you tell me if this happens. I don't think it's my words. I don't think it's my ability to have developed ideas about this within the context of that thinking that needs to be conveyed. And it's sort of what I was talking about in terms of the connotation and all that. We can all say things differently. And yet, if you have a sense of knowing, if something becomes aware to you that there is a little more going on than what you're just hearing in your own experience, you're beginning to admit this knowing awareness that you have. It's already there. It's already a knowing awareness. It isn't a thinking awareness, it's a knowing awareness. And if our thinking has been so chronically relied on, we've been chronically denying that awareness while thinking we have to think and understand things the way other people do, rather than see they're actually giving us, like you said, they're giving us some perspective, some bullet points, some points to kind of pull our limited thoughts and say, wow, if I can pull these thoughts, they're incredibly flexible. If they're flexible, they're probably permeable. If they're permeable, they're probably transparent and illusory and can absolutely change just like the fog does with the breath of air. And start to see that we're really witnessing that capacity. Now, we've been thinking so hard that understanding is the sole source, but if misunderstanding has been the guide about our basic thinking, then we haven't been thinking about thinking and understanding being our sole source. We've been thinking a lie is our sole source and that something conflicted. We always have to overcome and get there and find more and do more and think more and have more. And somehow it's never here. It's always somewhere else with something else or more or less of something else and someone else. Rather than start to notice, and I suspect you are aware of this because I suspect it's our basic awareness, that I hear people say a lot, I don't understand you, but something feels right. And they don't understand what it is that feels right, but they understand it enough to admit it feels right. And what feels right about it is that there's some stability in it. There's some sense of knowing. And my sense is we've been so dissected in our thinking that we've really believed that knowing sense isn't there. Now imagine something that would be permanent and absolutely stable being thought of as not there simply because of the instability of the thinking we're doing and the preoccupation we have with trying to manage that instability rather than saying, if it's unstable, the basis of the thinking is unstable. Of course, I'm going to feel unstable. Of course, I'm going to feel like I constantly have to fix it. I have to overcome it. I have to feel better than it. Of course, I'm going to wear my body out with stress and tension and all that because I'm going to undermine all the capacity it has to heal and function properly. So it's that knowing awareness. I think mothers know it with their kids. They have a sense of those kids that goes way beyond other people. That body lived in their body. They have a sense of knowing that's much more metaphoric for this broader sense of knowing that we all share. And you can't put a finger on it. You couldn't possibly explain it, but you could spend a lifetime trying and feel like you failed. While in fact, none of to your point earlier too, which I think is interesting, for all the various ways we see things and perceive things, the light spectrum is the light spectrum. Whatever the range of, and it's an infinite array of colors because the variations between them as they get smaller, just like trying to make points in a line, the smaller you get, you begin to realize that some other shade is hidden within that smallness, that some other slight shade. And these are what the infinitesimals were that Sir Isaac Newton and Leibniz turned into calculus. It was beginning to reckon with this slight variation of a curve never being able to be pinpointed because every point of the pin would be bigger than the other points beneath it and end up eliminating the possibility of actually making the point. Now that may seem very cerebral, but the point—
No, it makes sense. And if you apply it to everything you're saying, it's runs parallel.
Yeah. And what happened with them, which I know I've talked about in other episodes, other times, is that when they applied the infinite as a symbol, an 8, sideways 8 was their symbol, as soon as they applied that into algebra, calculus was created because it started to account for all of those infinite possibilities without naming them as numbers and places, just simply acknowledging that they existed in an unnameable place. And what happened to the lines is they become gracefully fluid. All the lines in algebra were points. They were a straight line between points, so they were choppy. In calculus, they become this gracefully fluid thing. And both of them said, we're not trying to tell you that there's something infinite that exists. We're simply saying when you apply it to this formula, everything becomes graceful. Interesting that that would happen and to not have any basis in reality. But they didn't want to turn it into a religious problem when they were trying to simply solve a mathematical problem. So if that knowingness is our knowingness and we're talking about something, and yes, it can seem cerebral, especially because the obsessive thinking is cerebral and it is based in our thinking, we have become very accustomed, in my experience, to thinking that obsessive thinking is thinking, that that's all thinking is. So when I talk to people about letting this go, they say, well, you're telling me not to think. You're telling me not to be anybody anymore. And I'm saying, no, do you see how closely aligned you are with your obsessive thinking is defining you and defining reality, rather than seeing thinking as a function that humans are given to benefit each other and to actually develop the possibilities of the abundance we have and work in a direction, just as you pointed out. How do I make this useful? How do I make this practical? How do I make this beneficial? Well, certainly thinking in ways that are completely not true would not lead to that final awareness. And yet, thinking of things as they are, absolutely true. My experience has been I start doing things without even thinking about it, and then realize after the fact I never would have thought of that if it hadn't, if that basis, I start giving credit to that absolute basis rather than wanting to take credit for it, which seems to be the ego dilemma. Is what I need to do is what gives me credit to look better, because all I am is an appearance, an illusion, trying to become reality. I'm trying to prove myself real. So I'm always looking for little bits of credit here and there, little bits of acknowledgement. Anything that doesn't fly in that direction, I think is hateful and spiteful and contemptful and beneath me to even have to listen to somebody say. When it's that presumption in my own thinking that's causing that reactive, impulsive, and ultimately compulsive behavior, trying to get away from it. While in mental problems, if you get away from it, like a bank robber, you're trying to get away from the problem. Getting away from it in mental problems is taking it with you, because your brain's going wherever you go in a human basis. So that other awareness is really what we're talking about. And it takes a minute to say, oh, I've kind of always known that. Like I watch when Jack Kerouac said that when the enlightened man is enlightened, he realizes he's always been enlightened. And he's talking about women too. And I know that I mentioned this before. So that concept's interesting, because to think we're not enlightened, to think we're not connected, those are just thoughts. And it's the content of the thought. It's not thinking, it's the chosen content that we're working, like that tribe that's only does light and dark. It doesn't mean there isn't anything else. It simply means they made a decision to see things that way. So that's the way they see them, and that's what they've stuck to. And just like the language and cultures have come up with all kinds of mythology and superstition to justify what they're doing, which is all based in imagination thought of as reality. Not reality, imagination. Imagination turns into a liability when it's thought of as reality.
Oh, I feel like your example there is of algebra and calculus, was it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I am still doing algebra and I'm like, give me the points, Jack. Give me the points so I
Right.
could track
Right.
them and create a pattern and give me the points. And you're like, Tara, it's just, there's no points. It's just infinity. It is just the flow, which actually, this is the book I pulled off my bookshelf. I've had this book here on my bookshelf for a long time. Uh, The Flow by Mihaly. I cannot say his last name. It's Hungarian. I know that much because he
Right.
looks exactly like my grandfather. They could be twins. But I don't know if you've read this book, or I have not read it. I've
No.
some thumb through it, but I suspect that I will find a lot in that book that aligns with more of the calculus than the premise is, basically, and I'm going to butcher this because I haven't read the book, but I do understand his notion of flow because I did a Toastmasters speech on it years ago before I got sober. And he talks about when we get into what you talk about, where you have things that you're doing and you would have never thought of that, and you're going with the flow. Is I remember him talking specifically about the flow around when time seems to fly by and you're like 2 hours went by and it feels like 5 minutes. That means you were, with your artistic guru and you were just doing your thing. You were in the flow. You were transcended time, transcended from time because you were just with the flow of I don't know what words he uses, but I'm inserting the word universe or whatnot. So I'm highly aware right now that I'm being recorded and I'm butchering this notion of flow by this amazing academic mind. So I'm going to stop talking.
Listen, presenting it at all recovery is about being willing to correct wrong, not always say the right thing, and starting to learn that the failure in the process is actually the learning. There is nothing to learn if I'm always right. So I have nothing to learn. And what do? I make believe there's nothing to learn in anything anybody else has to say. So I'm constantly fighting it. That would be obsessive thinking because everybody's always going to think something that I don't think. In whatever way they're thinking of it in a way that's unique to the combination of thinking they're doing, and yet it's based on the same platform. His flow, and I think your point about time passing is that my sense is in the present, where we are now, where we always are, the only place anything ever happens, there is no time. And when you're actually paying attention to what's happening, time doesn't take time because you're not dealing in time. You're actually just simply attending to what's immediately happening, not what you think should be happening, what you hoped was happening, what you wanted to have happen, not all those other conflicted potentials we have in thinking, but you're actually one-on-one working in that zone. I have a lot of artist friends in Venice that I met early on, and I started having conversations with them and I was fascinated. I didn't know what they did at first, but I was just fascinated by their ability to be interested, curious, and look at limits as an opportunity rather than an end. Rather than something that condemned them, they saw it as something that gave them the potential to look past it. And that's really what we're learning in the steps, is to take, rather than think we're stuck in the thought, is to start to see that we're really being asked to look past the thought. Now, we couldn't do that if we were actually in the thought. But when I think my thinking is reality, I think I become the thinking, and now I'm in the thought and lose all perspective whatsoever. I don't actually, but to the thinking I do. And that's the problem. I begin to think thinking is reality, so I have no perspective, and I can't do anything but defend the position I've taken. And that little bubble of a universe that I call my world now becomes a defensible. Now my life depends on maintaining that defense, that limit. So second step, we talked about the first step last time, says came to believe in a power greater than us could restore us to sanity. What does that mean? In the first step, we were insane thinking we had power in the lie that we could drink and use, and that we could control and enjoy it, and that we could do it like normal people who didn't have the allergy. The allergy in the mental arena is lying. The allergy is reactiveness. What's an allergy? An abnormal response. That's reactiveness. What does that mean? I do the same thing over and over again, hoping it's going to get better. Because it feels better, I think it is better. And what's interesting in the annals of allergies is that most allergies do not feel better when you eat the thing that you're allergic to. Most people who have a bee allergy do not want to get near bees. They wear long sleeves, they wear covers when they're playing golf. They do not want to get anywhere near a bee because it doesn't feel good when they get stung. They know their body is at risk. A peanut allergy, somebody chokes, they suffocate. They're not going to do it again. With alcohol and all these other compulsions we choose, it feels good for a moment. We think that that alternate experience is altering reality. Because we think our thinking is reality, we think by altering it, we're altering reality, when all we're doing is creating a delusion that our life depends on that thinking. So we
That
came,
completely makes sense to me right now.
oh no, let's stop.
No, I'm not being sarcastic.
I know you are. I get it. And the we've been trying to, in my experience, language has been used to try to simply promote an alliance amongst others who are also thinking wrong, to give us the impression that more and more people thinking like us is better, when in fact more and more people like us thinking like us is not better if what we're thinking is wrong. And it's the exact same thing with using. When I stopped using and drinking, a lot of the friends I had, lifelong friends, just stopped calling. There was nothing we had in common anymore. All that stuff sort of dissipated. It took years to have a relationship. But the conspiracy theory, that idea that we're all part of this thing, and now we're going to create a new theory about reality and all of a sudden look for other conspirators, it's very easy to do when all you think you are is how you appear rather than how you actually are. So in the second step, we're actually asking, think about it, it says, came to believe in a power greater than ourself. Okay, who's the self? Thinking about thinking itself, we have determined is ourself. If we think all we are is what we think, we must think thinking about thinking is itself is ourself. And if we're being asked to look at something greater than ourself, we're simply being asked to overlook the thoughts, not by denying them, but just simply noticing that when we look past them, like the mariners when they discovered the horizon was not the edge of doom, that it was actually the beginning of everything else, we start realizing that the limits we've been maintaining are actually the beginning of everything rather than the end of anything. So we don't feel doomed, we feel what? Adventure. There's exploration now. There's potential now. There's actually reality being addressed in its fullness, and the value of that reality is abundant. So we're going to act in ways naturally. If we can act effectively in ways that give us the impression we need to work hard to be productive, if we stop doing the thing that's giving us the impression that we're unproductive, that's totally unproductive, we'll naturally start aligning with reality because it's always been the same way. Reality hasn't changed while we've been changing our thinking about it. It's been reality, and nature's been nature, and nature's been doing what nature's been doing the whole time we've been on Earth as far as a species. And it's always developed. It always seems to heal itself when we stop hurting it. So it's starting to see in the doing of, there's not a lot of points that can be made if someone isn't interested in listening to those points. But if you can consider something that may have possibility, and that's why I always say if there's an infinite possibility, and if there's an infinite source, if there's an absolute source, if there is an unlimited source, if there's an omnipotent, omniscient source, because it's each person's decision that affects their experience. And I cannot make that decision. The beauty of free thinking and the ability to think what we want in terms of what we're capable of choosing is that everybody gets to do it. Each of us. And the problem with that is that when you want to act like a victim, you don't think you have anything to do with it, which means you also can't immediately come to the conclusion there's nothing you can do to fix the problem. And that's addiction in a nutshell. If I don't have anything to do with it, I certainly can't imagine having anything to do with solving it. So what do? I maintain the problem in the name of making believe it's fixing it, that I'm going to get better. Try to feel better about it all the time. I try to get over it all the time. I try to get through it. Life's just difficult. I just got to live with it and get through it. The flow is not so much a flow from here to there. It's a present flow that's always new wherever we are. So the newness is ultimately the flow, not because it's coming from anywhere, because it's always present here. It's just the nature of that presence. If it's always new, it can't be old, and it can't be on a time continuum at all. So we've been so conditioned to think about what should have happened and what would be happening if what should have happened, could have happened, might have happened, we wished it happened, would have happened, and now would be easier. That's been wrong all along, because now is as easy as it can possibly be in reality, because it's everything that is. It's already here. It's already now. It's always the same exact thing all the time, with everything that's happening being whatever's happening in any single moment in time. And again, a moment would be a lot compared to this infinite present state. So conceiving of those things did not need to be understood in language. And I can assure you, when I started talking about this, people got cross-eyed, and I just had a sense of it and wanted to start talking about it more publicly, because I realized I'd never gotten good at actually speaking to something that I always had a sense was there. There was always some sense that it was there. And why wouldn't it make sense that it was always there? That would make common sense, which doesn't seem very common today. Seems like common sense is the least common thing, because there's a lot of nonsense being made in the name of righteousness, and in the name of what has to be done, and in the name of what the hell why would somebody do that? And we're witnessing it. Mass shootings, kids. This hasn't happened through history a lot. This is a new way of saying, I'm going to make the final stand here. I'm going to make my final point. It's like suicide is basically the last act of self-control. I'm going to prove I'm in control. And all I'm doing is proving I can kill a body because I'm free to do it, while in fact the thing I'm afraid to do is actually face the thinking that's giving me the impression that killing that body is the best thing I can do. Think of how much we must fear what we're actually creating, and loathe and hate and abuse the self we think we are, and then think from that premise we're going to think more about it and get better at doing that, rather than see the repetition of it is killing us, literally undermining our body's ability to function, including my right hip. My suspicion, I have a hip problem in my right side. I don't think it's the hip. I think it's my hip flexors. I think it's all the muscles that have always been so tight that they're bound around those nerves. And what really hurts is the tension when it's like a clam. My hip flexors that should be flexible are like clams, and they're suffocating those nerves. And when I trigger those, I have pain, but I can move my hip perfectly. So my sense is it's in the tension in the muscle. It may be a different condition that you're dealing with, but very often when things have been let go too long, they don't just immediately get better, because it's taken them 30 years to get worse. Sort of that same, it's like the connotation of a disease. The evolution of it changes over time, and the impact of it becomes more and more obvious. And pain, as you know, is an indication something's wrong. And to think of it as right is to think getting over it is the solution, while the pain medication actually gives us the sense of freedom, while we're actually destroying further and further and further whatever's wrong underneath it. It's exactly what we do with the thinking. Exactly. So that altered state we create in sobriety, in drinking or using drugs or whatever we're doing compulsively, is simply giving our attention something to focus on that isn't happening, that feels better. It's actually, my body is responding. Like denial is psychic anesthesia. If I can think what's happening isn't happening for a moment, I'm asking to be numb and insensitive to what's happening. For sentient beings, that's exactly the opposite of our design. So you can see the death wish in that. It's actually asking I be dead so I don't experience anything, because ultimately, if I didn't exist, none of the problems would be happening. Very interesting. The problem with that is that if my body dies, then I actually have a spirit that lives on. I haven't killed the problem. I thought I did by killing the body, but in fact, I still have a spirit, so life goes on. In Shakespeare's To Be or Not to Be, he's saying that's what makes cowards of us all. The idea that there's a dream, that there's something else beyond this, is the thing that has people stop and say, wait a minute. If I'm actually dreaming there's something better out there, I'm realizing there may be something better here. And he says that makes cowards of us all. That's interesting. 500 years ago. William, by the way.
I know. No.
So if we've been thinking about it incorrectly and simply not talking about it, it wouldn't be a wonder that talking about it would be somewhat unsophisticated. And yet speaking about it more accurately in any way would be very illuminating, because the interest would be there, and some curiosity would probably be there, and some wanting of understanding would be there. And those would be all urges that would be, I would say, survival oriented, because there's a reckoning with what's happening. There's a recognition that maybe there's more going on than I think. And the thing you talked about earlier in terms of that knowingness is intuition. It's exactly what the big book talks about. We'll intuitively know how to handle situations that used to baffle us. Intuition, by definition, is knowledge beyond reason. It means there's no reason, logic, or thinking in it at all. We just know we know. Because knowledge in an absolute sense is just knowing it knows. It doesn't sit around and think. There's nothing to think about. It already knows everything. So it's a state of being that's very different than the state of thinking we do. And yet, when we start seeing the state of thinking we do accurately in its entirety, you begin to realize, oh, this is a function, a thing that was designed to express that knowing. We're actually designed to let that knowing flow through us in the present, because that's where the totality of everything that's happening is for humans and this universe and whatever may or may not be beyond that universe. It can't be dissected and also be infinite at the same time. It can't be life after death if there isn't life in death. And isn't it interesting that we see our life pass before our eyes, honestly, before we die, and think during life we forget the responsibility we have for all these things? Curious that while we have plenty of time, we say, I didn't do any of it. And when we have no time at all of a sudden we face it honestly.
My mother used to say, if you want something done, ask the busiest person you know.
Yeah.
So that reminded me of that.
The other side of it is that efficiency and effectiveness is transformed dramatically when you start simply acknowledging that knowingness is something everyone else already knows, rather than see them for their faults. And the identification of those faults, in my estimation, is actually the acknowledgement of my own unwillingness to admit those faults in my own experience. I'm using them to get perspective on what I'm doing and thinking I'm not doing, or thinking I'm not doing as egregiously as them, or thinking it's not impacting me. But if it's dysfunctional, it's impacting me dysfunctionally. So I'm using them as an excuse to blame and fault, rather than say, thank you for the opportunity you've given me to see that I'm doing this thing. Even if I don't think I'm doing it, if I start simply saying, for me to see it so clearly in them, I must be doing it clearly in my own experience. I wouldn't be bothered if I didn't have that. If I didn't have the bullseye, there would be no place for the arrow to land. And it starts to turn the totality of things in a very different direction in terms of the experience. So we say in a relationship, thank you rather than fuck you. Because when I'm willing to see it as somebody else, they're toxic and I don't like toxic people and all that kind of stuff. And I generally break that off with, screw you. I don't want anything to do with you anymore. What I don't want to do with that person is constantly face what it is that they're revealing in me. And I'm not taking advantage of the experience of that pain and conflict and saying, wait a minute, this is my classroom. This is my educational opportunity. This is the curriculum perfectly designed for me in my experience. The me I'm calling me. It's giving me a chance to look at my human functional capacity and say, wow, I can't be functioning very well if I'm constantly trying to figure out what's wrong with everybody else. And I think I'm right about that. While in fact, if I have that same wrong, I'm wrong about the idea that I don't have it. That would be a major conflict in my own experience, and a very divisive conflict with everyone else. There is no division in something that's infinite. So if it worked in calculus, I would imagine it would work in our own ability to apply the concept simply by considering it rather than believing in it and having faith in it and trusting it and admitting it. Just simply saying, if we are based in an infinite source, all of a sudden the clarity of all the dysfunctional thinking I'm doing starts to become more obvious. So I begin to actually feel worse because I begin to actually feel better about what I'm feeling. I'm getting better at feeling what's happening because I'm looking at it accurately. I'm starting to see through the lens, wow, I have been doing this stuff chronically for years and thinking it defined me, wondering why I keep doing this in relationships, different faces, different places, different times, same thing over and over again. I'm the promoter of it, the projector of it. So the knowing sense knows. And if it is a knowing awareness that's the root of this absolute loving, supportive, abundant source, then we know that. And the discussion is about starting to recognize that even in the midst of not understanding, It may simply be the thinking that's becoming clear that's not understandable that we're doing, that's giving us this constant looping around it, trying to make it right because we've been doing it so long, but we're starting to see it clearly and say, oh, that's actually really obsessive to constantly be thinking on the wrong basis, that somehow my thinking has to add up to what I already know. Why would I have to think about it if I already know it? And start to really begin to realize that this absolute state is absolute. It is not an exceptional, optional, negotiable state of being. That's now beginning to actually ponder meditatively and contemplatively life itself, not the ideas we have about life and death. Just becomes vast and vast and vast. If you consider the infinite as something that never ends and just keep considering it, you'll notice there's not a lot of obsessive thinking going on at the same time, because as your thoughts grow and grow and grow, you realize they can grow as big as they want, and they're going to be tiny compared to this thing you're thinking about. And all of a sudden you realize it's not even a spatial thing. It's just a present thing. It's something here now, but it isn't divisible in any way. It's very difficult for a rational brain based on reason to come to terms with that, but also very easy to come to terms with it when the terms used begin to reinforce the absolute nature rather than this relative tit for tat. I did this, she did that, they did that, all that stuff. And one of the ways to do it is just realize truth is true, reality is reality. Things are as they are right now, absolutely, in every way they are. Doesn't matter what I think about them. I don't have to like them. They're how they are. And then I start seeing what my brain does with it and start to say, oh, that's interesting. I think they shouldn't be happening. Well, while everything's happening, that would be a pretty major glitch in my thinking to imagine it shouldn't be happening. There's inner conflict 101. If I think I need to like it for it to be happening, that's just a thought in relation to what's happening. I don't, if I don't like it, I actually learned that I like not liking it. I have an investment in that not liking it. That identifies me. It gives me some characteristic, some defective characteristic, and this is where the defects all reside in this personality before principles. This idea that my personality is going to conclude principles, then I can rely on them someday, somehow, somewhere, but never here now, where I always am, and start to realize that if principles are the basis of everything, at least in the physical realm, it must be a very principled source that knows everything to allow that principled basis to exist as long as it has, as well as it has, to allow us the chance to even contemplate it right now. That's the flow. The flow is the newness, always new. What does it mean? Always everything possible is possible. What does that mean? What's impossible is still impossible. And the only impossibility that I can come up with is that a lie will never be true. And the only thing that the lie is based on is the idea that it is true. So it's trying to be exactly the opposite of what it is. And the metabolic undermining of our capacity is the inability to process reality while I'm in that mindset. Doesn't mean reality isn't there. It doesn't mean I'm disconnected from it. It means that I have chosen to disconnect my functional capacity from it in the name of making believe that I can control it and have my own. That's a pretty sick thought to have when I've already got it and I'm trying to have it as something distinct from reality that's indivisible by creating my own division of identity, which we call ego. And even ego by nature is capital I, meaning the self we all share, not the one that we each create. In Latin, going back into history.
It's dawning on me that
I like that word.
I am not only am I addicted to my thinking, but I have based who I am around my study of thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, look at my bio. Like, literally, I have been fascinated with thinking because it's like alcohol. It is, you can play with it, you can use your imagination, you can change the way you feel when you think certain things. You could, I mean, it's just this tool to live in what is not reality.
Well, it only becomes not reality when we think of it as real. When it's imagination.
Everybody thinks it's real except for you, Jack.
Well, I'm not sure. But even if they do
Little
think that,
hyperbole, but
yeah, I
every
think
self-help book you pick up.
exactly. But think about that. Who is the self they're helping, but the one we think we are, not who we are. They're not helping the being, they're helping the self. Self-help identifies that. Self-abuse identifies that. Self-confidence, self-worth, self-this, self-that. Look up the number of words in the dictionary that start with self, and it's almost as though the subsequent work takes on a whole new meaning when you attach it to this identity of self. And it has taken on a whole new meaning. We think it's who we are. That's when we think who we are is what we think. That's how we think we're stuck in thoughts, because we think our whole life is dependent on maintaining those thoughts, when in fact it isn't. So we're scared to death, constantly maintaining this. There's always fear in our experience, because self-centered fear would be it's actually thought-centered self that's causing this, because I think in the midst of my thinking about my thinking, I live. So I'm centered in that thinking all the time, and there's no other place for me to be in the universe. While I have a greater knowing sense, I know what I'm doing is eroding my capacity to even function literally and functionally as a human. And so I have fear naturally. That's the language of the body telling me I'm doing something that is wrong. I am choosing to live on a premise that is absolutely unfounded. So, to your point about feeling better, if simply by thinking we can affect our body chemistry to have our laboratory in our bodies create chemicals that give us a feeling of better, imagine the chemicals we will start creating that go well beyond the ones we try to synthesize through concentration of nature, will start naturally occurring in our own body, just like endorphins were discovered. They were basically morphine. They make you feel better when when you get enough blood into or oxygen into your body through exercise. You reach a level where your body's really thankful for that activity because it's good for it. If we've been creating drugs that have been synonymous with the thinking we're doing, the caustic nature of our drugs have been cannibalizing our body's capacity, and even cannibals through history have not been known to eat themselves, and we're doing it full view in our own experience. Disease has become considered common. Healing is thought of as a miracle and absurd to even think about. Our bodies are designed to heal naturally, just like nature heals. So that chemical factory is, I don't suspect we've even gotten close to the capacity. If Einstein said we're using 5 to 8% of our brain, he's talking about the fact that 92% we're not paying attention to at all. Does that mean we don't know it? No, it means we're not paying attention to it. We're not choosing to look at it honestly enough to actually let that realm be expansive enough that our contemplative meditation is beginning to consider the basis of our reality as the basis of reality, rather than simply the limited thoughts that we feel defensive about trying to attach to. And in all cases, thoughts create narratives. Like the story we tell about who we are and what we think and all that stuff. Those are just narratives we're developing. Thoughts attached to the landscape that we're seeing. They attach to those stories the same way that dreams attach to those stories. And this is just a daydream that we think we're not sleeping because our eyes are open, while in fact our brain is asleep to the things that we want to pretend aren't happening. It isn't really, but we just think they are, because to put our brain to sleep and then think it's awake would be to admit it's not sleeping. So the simplicity about uncovering this is it's so simple that it's just realizing that whatever isn't happening right now isn't happening. And if I'm thinking it's happening, that doesn't mean it's happening. It means I think it's happening. Oh, if there's no substance to it, there's no reality in it. It's just something I'm perpetuating. And how do I know that? I feel bad. I don't feel good. I feel caustic. I feel like I want to remove myself. I feel reactive to other people. I don't want to be near people. I want to get away. I want to be alone. I just want to nurture that thought as though no competition to it secures it. And what does it do? I get further and further in a depressive state. So as a basic, we know. And if as you're thinking about things as though you don't know, and you admit you know, one of the things that happened early on in the podcast was I realized that I always used to think when I lost something that I'd lost it. very often my keys. And I started realizing I was the last one who had them. How convenient that I would then conclude I don't know where they are. I thought that's pretty absurd. So I started saying, I know where they are. I just don't think I know. It really helped me to begin to notice the difference between my knowing, my real memory, rather than the selective memory I use to say, gee, I don't remember that, so I must not have done it. I couldn't possibly be responsible for it. And if you were impacted by it, you better look elsewhere because it wasn't me. Right. So all of a sudden I started, and I'd just say, just admit you know. And say, okay. And it felt uncomfortable to actually know that I know, right? Like dealing with anything absolute feels very uncomfortable because it reveals the clarity of all the limited ideas I have prancing around as though they're absolute. But then I'd start thinking, oh, I know where they are. I know exactly where they are. And I'd go get them. It would just pop into my head when I stopped pushing against with the idea that I didn't know. Just would sort of arrive. So it doesn't always happen that quickly, but a lot of times I say, I know it, and then I keep thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it contemptfully. Where are they? Where are they? I need them. I need them. I need that fear sort of gives me this impression that I got to get to work. I got something here that's really important. And I start noticing, wow, okay, well, if I've developed that habitually, doesn't mean I need to continue. I can, I'm free to start to notice I can do exactly what I'm doing that's causing the problem and accept it as something I'm doing rather than something I shouldn't be doing and I need to overcome and I need to stop. If I'm treating the effect by trying to stop it, I'm not looking at the cause and starting to live with it. And I've done so little of that in my life, it feels very awkward just to stay still and say, oh, I'm doing it again. So I started saying exactly what my mother used to say to me when she looked into my eyes and she knew something was going on. She said, you're up to something. And I would do that stupid look like, me? Which
With
would
the
help
thought of how
confirm.
the hell does she know?
But now I say that to my own experience. When I don't think I know what I'm doing, if I know what I'm doing, I know what I'm doing. If I know, I know, I know. Then to think I don't is just a construct of thinking. And when I start to introduce the knowing I know to my thinking, all of a sudden my thinking relaxes a little bit, but it also exposes that sort of reactive, impulsive, I got to get back to work. I got to back. And all of a sudden it starts to become obvious how sick I've been about this and doing this so long to make believe it's the only thing I can do. And it starts to dissipate in that just sitting and breathing and starting to notice it. Doesn't mean it won't come back. Doesn't mean I won't rely on it again when I feel a little overwhelmed and circumstances don't seem to be going the way I thought they should. But in every one of those, I'm learning to dissolve the problem, meaning to literally look at this vaporous image illusion that I have as reality and start noticing it isn't, and that it's see-through. I found that when I looked at problems mentally and started actually just staring them as I thought of them, I could all of a sudden see right through them and see beyond them and see how much more there was and start realizing that it was kind of like a forest. And I stopped right at the beginning of the trees thinking, that's it. That's the permanent. I was creating this imagery that gave me the contention that my thinking was right. But if I sat with it, I'd go right through it and realize, oh, there isn't anything there. I'm just imagining that. And that's just a thought.
That's a great example of something applicable that is my algebra data point where, oh, okay, with the keys example. And it reminded me of another thing my mom used to say, which was, as soon as you stop trying to think of it, it'll come to you.
Exactly.
So just stop and let it go, and it'll come back to you. And it's almost like her way of saying, let your intuition kick in and stop trying to find it with your thinking.
Well, your intuition can't be kicked in or out. It's always on. It's always complete. It's the insistence that I'm trying to look that I'm also having the opposite thought that I've lost it. I'm really tamping down on the idea that I can't remember, right? So every thought we have has an opposite. I either
Right.
like something or I don't like something. I either think it is, or if I think it is, I think something else isn't. So if I start looking at the wholeness of what I'm doing and saying, well, if I really like this, it's because I don't like something else. And if I don't like this, it's because I like something else more. And I began to realize that I really like unliking things. And I really don't like liking those things. So I see the wholeness of it all of a sudden that brings the neutrality, which is something I can do immediately because I sort of take the teeter-totter that seems to be constantly moving and just center it, which also led to the point that the teeter-totter is already sitting on something central to be able to teeter and totter. So if my foundation is stable and all I'm doing is manipulating it with the thinking I'm giving credit or no credit to, I'm the one causing all that stuff. I can stop the cause and I can start the cause. Once I do, I can think anything and I don't feel condemned by it at all because I know it's just a thought. I'm starting it. In your definition of that 2 hours you spent, think of how grace within the calculus plays into that. Time didn't seem to be there at all because there was no weight to it. There was no struggle in it. It was just the present state of a present state that was absolute. There's no time in that at all.
Mm-mm.
And we say time flies when we're having fun, yet nobody wants to rush to death at the same time. It's interesting. We can't wait for time to pass until we think about death, and then we think we want to prolong life, while we're in fact minimizing the capacity of life in the present in an absolute sense by thinking of it as something that leads to death when it doesn't. It's just an absolute state of being that is always aware, always knowing, always present. There is no other place for it to be. There is no other thing for us to get. There, none of it. It's already just as it is. And if you watch your words, you'll watch your words describe the thoughts you have that are very contrary to that thinking. Like, I can block my intuition. I need to tap into God. Think of that. That means it's our doing. God without us would be untappable. We think of it in terms that are very much exclusive to the self-centered ideas that thinking about thinking is the totality of our existence, rather than beginning to see that the self we think we are is simply thinking about thinking. And that, when you start thinking about thinking, it becomes easy to see what thinking is valuable for, rather than think of it as something that preserves a life that doesn't exist. And everything has to do with appearance, and what other people think become incredibly important when we think who we are is all we think. Because now we got to align the whole world about the thinking we have, or else we're dead or in constant misery.
Yeah. So how do you apply that to step 2?
We're looking beyond the thoughts to begin with. We're just being asked to came to believe in a power greater than ourself. What does that mean? Beyond the limits of our thinking, that could restore us to sanity. There's 2 questions. Can a power that's infinite, does that power exist? And the second one is, can it help me with my problem? As I understand the step. So if the first one is that I'm stuck in my thinking and what I'm suffering from is insane, then drinking as a compulsion is the same thing. Drinking for an alcoholic is insane. Every compulsion becomes insane because it's trying to fix a problem by treating the effect of the problem rather than the cause of the problem. And what step 2 is saying is we're restored to sanity, meaning in step 1, we're insane thinking we have power over something that's completely and consistently proven to us not to be true, while we consistently, insanely make believe that someday it will be if we just do more of it. That's an allergy that feels better, but it eventually starts feeling worse, and we know it's worse, and we keep trying and trying and trying and trying. This is not doing the same thing expecting a different result. This is doing the same thing over and over again, knowing the exact result and still trying. That's real insanity. So step 2 is coming to believe in a power greater than ourselves that can restore us to sanity. Question is, does that power exist? I can't tell you that it does. I can suggest that thinking about it certainly is possible, which would mean that it's certainly within the realm of not only possibilities, but if it's relied on, may prove to be useful and helpful. And that would be the answer to the second question. Can it help me, restore me to sanity? Well, if the insanity is thinking my limited thought is reality, and I'm struggling with that, certainly thinking beyond my thoughts would be the beginning of seeing something that I never imagined possible. And it's that simple. So we're looking now like the sailors that started exploring the world and discovered surprisingly tea and tropical islands in Tahiti that they never could have imagined because they hadn't bothered to pass over the horizon. And see, also the irony of the horizon is you can never achieve it on a sphere. You can never get to it.
It's true.
The more you go, the more there is to see, and that becomes a much better inducement than the self-imposed, self-induced misery and depression and inner struggle and mental anguish and emotional turmoil created by maintaining this circular notion that if I go in circles longer, somehow I'm going to prove the reality because I'll pay no attention to anything other than what I'm doing that will prove that it's reality. What it proves is that we're absolutely insane, that we want our attention to be paid to things that hurt, that cause suffering, and we think by doing that somehow or another we're going to get better. So the beautiful thing about belief in this regard is that if we've been believing insanity will one day become true, no amount of belief will make that happen. No amount of belief will ever be enough to have that happen. And yet, if we come to believe that there's a power greater than ourselves, immediately, in that sincere gesture, that sincere consideration, that honest consideration, because it's not saying just try it as though you're trying it, like you're appearing to try it, and then discount it because it doesn't appear to be real immediately, so you can continue to support the contention of all the insanity you've been perpetuating. It's talking about sincerely saying, well, if this exists, it exists. And it really isn't up to my thinking to conclude that. But when I start thinking that way, I start actually realizing that there is something, because my real eyes are starting to see with vision the capacity of things that seem invisible to my normal senses, but seem clearly present to my sense of well-being. And there's something that happens when that transition's made that clearly says we will no longer regret the past, nor be afraid of the future, because we're starting to recognize that we're actually looking at what's happening in the present. We talk about it a day at a time, but it's really a moment at a time. It's really a here now at a time. And all that's really happening is time isn't passing, but things are changing that on a continuum of time are always exactly where they are, and the sum total of everything that's ever happened is right now. Everywhere everything has ever happened has led to this moment. We are never apart from any of it. We are a part of all of it. Little different way to start the day.
Yeah.
So the other point of that is belief in something real is confirmed immediately when it's applied. When it's honestly considered, the immediate experience, these moments of clarity, that vital spiritual experience just occurs, not because it hasn't been there, but because we haven't allowed the thought that it could possibly be there, that it could be maybe something beyond our thinking actually is reality, and it isn't even beyond our thinking, because then you realize it's within and without. It isn't one or the other. It isn't somewhere else. It's actually the essence of our existence. And we've been chronically, delusionally, and insanely making believe it isn't. And then what have we done? Create different gods that we can fight over to make believe our concept of God is true and real, so that we once again become responsible for creating God and justify killing other people to prove we're right, when any of that kind of violence and any of that kind of degradation is an indication something's seriously wrong. If it leads to pain, there's something wrong with it. Period. So becoming numb to pain is the psychic anesthesia of denial, making believe that what's happening isn't happening. And it doesn't mean what's happening isn't happening. It means we delude ourselves into making believe the thoughts we're having that are insane and lies have substance, which they don't. The great substance abuse is imagining there's substance to a lie. It has no denominator whatsoever. The denominator is zero. The numerator is everything we want to put on it. It never becomes whole, a whole number or a number at all. It does not count. So why wouldn't we feel less than, worthless, low self-esteem? There's no esteem in it. There's no value in it. There's no worth in it. To even think it's less value, low self-esteem, is to think there's some self-esteem when there isn't any at all. It's, again, we're giving ourselves credit. Even low self-esteem would be infinitely more credit than the credit due, which is none. So if we're trying to eke out a little more self-esteem, we're trying insanely to continue to accomplish and to achieve that a lie will someday be true if I keep focusing on it, keep thinking about it, keep getting closer and closer to it, keep spending more time on it. It's exactly what we did when we were drinking. First drink was never enough. We had to be sure there was at least another one nearby coming. And if 2 o'clock was coming, it was time to it was hammer time. If there's not going to be any drinks after 2, you got to get them all in last minute. No matter how many you've had, it's never enough to avoid the need for more. It's the same with the thinking, because the thinking is primary to the alcohol and any other compulsion. It's the single sole source of all the compulsive behaviors, and reactive and impulsive, I would add. That whole list of things. Nothing wrong with the reaction when the threat is real. When the threat is self-induced and self-imposed, it's induced by a self that is only imagined to be real and imagined to be our life, that doesn't actually even breathe, doesn't have any blood, it has no content whatsoever. That's exactly what a lie is. No content. We choose the content of our thinking. That's what we struggle with when we make believe it's reality and truth. So we aren't struggling with reality and truth. We're struggling with our thought of reality and truth. Always. There's no struggle in reality and truth because it's not divisible. And being indivisible means that our ultimate vision is the visibility of understanding when we start understanding things correctly rather than misunderstanding them as the basis of our thinking and wonder why things keep going wrong. Think of, again, misunderstanding and substance are saying the same thing. Well, understanding and substance. Understanding means beneath our feet, and substance is beneath our feet. Meaning there's something there. Consider gravity to be one of the great metaphors for this essence. We can't see it. We don't even understand it yet. We have some ideas about it, but we really don't understand it. And yet we rely on it all the time. There's nobody on this planet that isn't being held to this planet by it. And this planet is being tethered by this invisible source of force, or whatever it is, in its orbit around the sun and doing all the things that are necessary for the entire universe to function without any argument whatsoever. We don't worry about it. We don't think about it, just like we largely don't think about what's happening in our body. Trillions of interactions going on simultaneously, and we don't worry about it until we hurt. And that's an indication, pay some attention here. If you have mental anguish, that's an indication to pay some attention to what you're doing. And it doesn't mean pay more of the same attention. It means to question what you're doing, which is why you feel doubtful and uncertain and all that. Your body's telling you that there's something uncertain, doubtful about what you're doing mentally to have those experiences. The addiction is to keep doing the same thing, thinking this will get better. Let me just look at it a little closer, a little harder, a little longer. Another 12, 20 years will probably do it. By then, it will be worn out that much more.
I'm without questions or potential debate to all of that. I'm processing.
Well, and sit, Tara, just as a suggestion, notice that there's an awareness that isn't that questionable. And some of what becomes questionable are the typical tendencies that you might employ. It's almost like they melt. You just notice they kind of dissipate. Because if it's all smoke and mirrors that we're creating reality out of illusion, as soon as we take a deep breath, it blows that fog away. The smoke goes away and the mirrors become clear. And let me tell you, it is incredibly distressing to start looking at this honestly, because what you'll be looking at is the thing you've been trying to outrun your entire life, thinking it was possible while it's been going with you everywhere you went. The idea of getting away with it, think of that term. We're actually getting away with it, not from it. And if we're constantly doing that, it's pretty demeaning to say, you mean I have spent decades committed to this insanity at a level that is so primal to my existence and or potential for non-existence in terms of my human experience, while I've been worried about dying, and I'm doing the greatest thing I could to undermine my capacity to live in terms of my human functions. It's distressing.
Yeah, disappointing is the word that's coming to mind. It's just quite disappointing.
Well, think about that. No longer pointing. Disappointing. But there's grief in it, in my experience. There's shame in it. There's guilt in it. And when shame and guilt are seen, guilt is seen not as a feeling, but as a verdict. I'm guilty. I've been admitting the whole time I was doing it, thinking of it as a feeling to try to transpose it into something else. I thought I needed to overcome the shame, but the shame was an accurate assessment. I've taken everything and squandered it on nothing, like the prodigal son. I've been given everything. And what have I done? I've wasted, literally, which is why, in my view, we talk about getting our shit together so much. I've wasted time, literally waste, thinking I was doing something while I've been undermining the potential of that doing because I haven't been doing anything but what I thought would serve the appearance of who I thought I was. And yet, to see it accurately is to say, if this is the lesson I needed to be in the place I am now, to see it clearly, and I'm seeing it from a point of view that isn't in time or space, then there's no amount of time I ever spent to do anything other than be here now. And boom, there's nothing.
Yeah.
There's an awe to it and a splendor that has allowed me. I cry more now than I ever have, largely because I sense that melting of the tension in my body is just letting it's letting the flow go, letting the physical. I've tried to maintain the stiffness in my body to make believe I'm in control when in fact it's killing me. And what it's also killing is my potential to have a relationship with you that's meaningful and anyone else. Because I'm looking for people that agree with me and buy into what I think rather than say, if you already know it, let's share that. Let's look into the bounty of that. And let's start looking well beyond the horizon, start noticing there is no horizon at all. That's just a topical illusion to even imagine that it's there and start seeing that we know it. We know. We're aware. And all those moments we missed people, not because they weren't there, but because what we were seeing of them is only what we thought. And what we heard from them is only what we thought they said, because it was clearly manufactured to support the contention that they were saying and doing what I wanted to see them do for the sake of my own interests, which often was have them do the wrong thing so that I could tell them to get fucked and walk away from them and think that I was the better person. And I never want to see them again. Of course, I don't want to see them. They're a reminder of what I'm looking at in the mirror every day. And there's shame in that. There's grief in that. There's a mourning in my experience. And yet, in the immediacy of the totality of everything, realizing that nobody was ever diminished by any of it, that no reality was ever altered by any of it, that no truth has ever been less told or more available as a result of it, is to start to realize that it's just been a silly fantasy, a silly imposter riding a horse that didn't exist, acting like it was cavalier and capable of accomplishing great things, and by looking like it was on a big parade that was all just a charade. And boom,
I,
the awareness doesn't come back. You realize it never left.
yeah. Yeah. I really, it, it's, um, rare that I have a lack of words. I always have some words, but in this moment in time, I am feeling, I guess, a little bit of a peek behind my own curtain, right? Like, who is behind this tarot curtain that's been moving all the dials, pretending to be, and the pretending to be didn't even know there was a curtain and there was someone behind the curtain. Not completely, but not surprising as that news at the same time. So if you're tracking any of that, but sheepish, I think that the
Wizard
word
of
that's
Oz.
coming to mind is sheepish. I'm feeling a little sheepish, like, whoa, feeling a little sheepish about that. And
Think
part
of
of
the innocence
me,
in that word.
what's that?
Think of the innocence in that word.
It is
Just
an endearing little innocent word, isn't it?
Well, and versus being a wolf, thinking you need to be on the prowl and looking to devour everything around you to kill it. It certainly indicates a moment of innocence rather than guilt, and sort
Fair
of a
enough.
purity. And my experience is, if by simply having this conversation, that contemplative ability we have to begin to meditate on things actual rather than presumed and inactual, and realize it, it's awe-inspiring, and nothing need be said, because the truth need not be told ultimately, because there's nothing to say about it. It's already everything. It's already true. Now the question is, you and I, if we have the potential of that reality, which has always been our potential, what could we do that would be more productive in that, which is what you were asking earlier about usefulness? Certainly recognizing it as the basis of our relationship rather than some rare thing that occasionally occurs after we talk about it long enough, even and despite how we feel, and say, well, it's here as it's here, regardless of how I'm feeling. And if I don't feel it's here, I'm obviously thinking thoughts are real enough to give me that feeling. And all of a sudden, I become very clear about what's happening, because my lens is clear. I'm seeing from clarity. I'm not seeing the curtain behind the Wizard of Oz has been down the whole time, and I realize somebody's just screwing with the scenery. And who's that somebody? Me. In terms of my own ability, in the I sense, in terms of my own ability to make choices with my own body that I've been given responsibility for, I can do whatever I want with it. And for me to do the worst I can probably isn't the best I can. And if that's the case for us as a species, there's probably a good chance that if this commonality exists between us and we start talking about it, just like they started talking about the Earth not being at the center of the universe, and all of a sudden astronomy it exploded in terms of its capacity to be understood. And when math was figured out, there was a point at which zero did not exist. And zero isn't a number. I think I wrote it in the announcement recently. Zero is not a number. It's simply a placeholder that allows math to function. And math is considered the universal language. So if nothing can turn the number system into the capacity to imagine everything, then certainly ego is not at the center of the thing that's going to give me that same view. But nothing, the absolute nature of this emptiness and this thing that the Buddhists have talked about in different religions through history, is that emptiness. But the emptiness today, the physicists are realizing, is actually full. It's actually got more matter in it, which may mean that there's more substance to it than all of the things we have thought mattered. So if all we thought mattered is what was depressing us, and it no longer matters, all of a sudden we're free to begin to conceive of things any way we want, including depressing things, and just say, oh, if it's depressing, I'm obviously bearing a weight I'm really not designed to bear. I'm designed to bear it as a weight to tell me it's wrong and start to correct. So you were asking last time, and I love that we're coming up to the end of our time on this point of correcting. If the initial point of this absolute nature is simply conceded rather than thought of as something I do, I am also relinquishing the thinking I've been doing about it that claimed it wasn't there. And now I can realize that it's there regardless of what I think. And I can start seeing how flimsy my thinking can be and start correcting my thoughts in a functional level, because I'm willing to adjust rather than fight and react and try to protect these thoughts. That need to do that is no longer there, because the basis of my existence isn't false anymore. So I'm not trying to protect against it. It's never been that way, but within my thinking it was. When I realized first it's concession, which we call surrender, but I don't like the word surrender because it supposes there's an actual enemy. That idea that something that isn't real is the whole basis of this. And it's insane to imagine there's something to surrender to when there's nothing there to fight. Nothing. In the infinite source, there's no conflict whatsoever. There's no divisibility. It's indivisible. It's not something that we can really fathom without being quiet in contemplation and start to realize that when I give it any consideration, that consideration just it's overwhelming in the greatest splendor, in the most awesome sense, in the greatest exploratory sense, in the greatest adventure. So initially, the concession is just, if it is, it is. And it's always been that way. It's always been that way while I've been insanely thinking it wasn't. The whole time it was always available. It was never gone. And it's here now. And what am I doing that would be wrong to give me another impression that will become depressing the longer I maintain it? Right now. It's the only place healing occurs. It's the only place happening occurs, is in the present, always.
My husband is a scientist and we think very differently. And he used to say, when I was in the crux of my disease before we were married, it was, you're just fighting against yourself. You're just fighting, let's just stop fighting yourself. And I have this analogy of me in the ring boxing myself. And like, I get knocked down and everybody is like, Tara, stay down, just stop. And I'm like, no, man, I got this. And I get back up with alcohol again. And just, so when it was alcohol, for me, alcohol, I was surrendering to, and I felt possessed by this outside thing. But what I'm connecting now is my husband was right. I was just fighting myself, pointing at alcohol, saying it was making me do it, or my genetics, or my blah, 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 insert whatever I was pointing to at the time. I have a disease, pointing, but I was just fighting myself. And ultimately, of course, my obsessive thinking about myself.
Well, consider this on closing, that there is no self to fight except the one we imagine ourselves to be. That's it. So if it's just imagined and we think it's real, this is the crux of this idea that our thinking, that the content of our thinking is reality rather than something we're choosing. It's just a thought we're having, and we're choosing the content of that thought. We may have no control over anything, and yet we control everything, because the sum total of everything that's happening right now, if we're making decisions right now, we're making it in relation to everything that's ever happened, because the present is the sum total of everything that's ever happened. And to be now thinking there's a self to fight, think about the doppelganger effect. You've created an absolute copy of yourself and you're going to fight. You're going to wrestle. That self would know exactly what to do with exactly every move. There's no win in that fight.
No.
It's absolutely impossible. It's exactly what we all feel when we keep trying harder and wonder why we get more worn out. The idea that that self exists is only maintained in the present by thinking there's a self that is a small self, rather than seeing the capital self is the sense of knowing that we all have simultaneously and actually and factually and now, presently. And it's the sum total of it all. It's not some bit and piece of it. We can't be apart from it because we are a part of it. And if we're a part of it, we're a part of all of it simultaneously. And beginning to understand what absolute means as absolute is beginning to see that there's no exceptions, there's no options, there's no negotiation in this at all. It's a present state of being, which is our meditative awareness that's constant. It isn't somewhere else, some other time, but to the seeming willingness of the insanity we have and the capacity we have to imagine that what we imagine to become true is to imagine illusions and fantasy as reality, which really undermines the whole point of imagination, because imagination is imagined means this is possible. I'm not sure it can happen, but I think it's possible because I can imagine it. And going down that road as a possibility of imagination allows the minor steps, like your husband would know as an engineer. Every tiny step needs to be taken methodologically to be able to end up at that point where the structure actually survives, because it's been done properly. If there's any weakness in that, that weakness undermines the entire integrity of the whole rest of the thing. Same with our thinking. When there's any bit of that thinking going on, it's because we're not thinking in absolute terms. We're thinking in relative terms and thinking the bits and pieces can be put together in some way that we'll be happy with sometime. But somehow the jigsaw puzzle seems to be missing some pieces all the time. Always trying, never doing. Always trying to get there, be there, have more, have less, do this, do that, rather than it's already here, it's already now, it's everything. Now, what am I going to choose? Am I going to choose to continue in that old way? That isn't even old, it's present, it's now, it's new. I'm going to re-choose that same thing that has failed 1,000 times, and I'm going to think somehow that all of a sudden neutrality allows the thinking to say, this makes no sense to even continue. And boom, it's gone. It doesn't come back. And if it does, you know what it is, you see it and say, oh, okay, well, I'm obviously going beyond some expectation I have based on the thought I have that's real. And I thought all that should be happening is what I'm thinking. And all of a sudden what's happening isn't what I'm thinking. And so I feel conflicted and overwhelmed. Okay. Boom, boom, boom. So all the things, the curriculum you're looking for in the discussion is starting to manifest in the facing of it and the intuitive awareness of it. And it's inspiring, to say the least, compared to the desperation that we've been relying on, constantly using fear and adrenaline as a source of trying to fix it, when you begin to realize that nothing's ever been broken. And ultimately, this is love. It's an ability to see, if everybody has this and we start seeing them on that basis, the ideas we have about them in terms of the petty things we think will dissipate very quickly, because we'll simply see it as nothing to do with them and everything to do with our own fractured state of thinking, or our own minimization of our thoughts being true. Boom, boom, boom. Instead of being explosive in the worst sense, it's just like a bubble popping, like champagne bubbles reaching the top of the glass. They just evaporate, they disappear. They feel fuzzy for a second. And I guess that would be true with Coca-Cola and any other soft drink that's mineral water. I don't have to.
Yeah, you could have gone with any other example. You had to pull out the alcohol one. All right.
Well, maybe I'm toasting our
All
conversation
right.
today. So I appreciate this as an opportunity to sit with someone genuinely interested in having the conversation, and also being challenged by it, because I know in my experience that this was a major challenge for me, just as you were talking about looking behind the curtain of Terra, looking behind. I had a panic attack when some of this started to occur to me, and I'd been writing about the ego, trying to define it. And I thought, I'm giving it more credit by thinking I could define it. And actually, that's insane. And bam, my whole body went gray. All the fear, so much of the fear that I had held in this notion just evaporated. But I got to witness it and sit with it and allow it to dissipate. It didn't just leave. The same process that accrued it was now dissipating it, allowing it to dissolve. Rather than a new solution, it was a dissolution. Literally, the abandonment of it, exactly as the book says. Abandon yourself utterly to this power. We trust this God's care and what is it? We trust his care and protection with abandon, meaning nothing else. That's all there is. So we don't have to define God as another self or another man-made thing to begin to realize that the concept is based on an infinite source that is indivisible for everybody everywhere and everything everywhere, all that is and all there are. It's the basis of existence. And now you and I are in the face of everything rather than the few things we think we have to do today. And now we can choose those things do not become so big when they're not all you're thinking about. They just become things to do, responsibilities, commitments I have. Do I want to continue them? Well, if I don't, I gotta rearrange the negotiation. I gotta renegotiate the agreement I made. Start to actually adjust accordingly, so we can right wrongs rather than fight for what isn't right.
All right, sir.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it. Yes, very much. Thank you very much. See you around campus.
Sounds good.
As we continue to learn.
That's right.
Hopefully grow.